welcome everybody to Heritage Calgary's 2025 Heritage Matters Speaker Series. Thanks for joining us this evening. It's thrilling to see a full house here. I also know there's a very important hockey game going on right now, so thank you for giving up your evening to spend it with us at this sold-out event. I'd like to thank the Calgary Public Library for their partnership and allowing us to use this wonderful space. The Memorial Park Library was built in 1910 with funds from the Carnegie Foundation, and it was designed not only as a book repository but also as a place for learning. And we're delighted to share this opportunity with you this evening to learn more about Calgary's mid-century architecture and those who envisioned and created it. I also want to thank the staff at Heritage Calgary for helping to put this event together. We're a small but mighty team. You've probably met Jody out front, who helped with the registration and greeting everybody. Josh, our CEO, is right over there. Shannon, our communications specialist, you might have seen her buzzing around, and Chris Axford, who couldn't be here this evening. Heritage Calgary is a civic partner of the City of Calgary, focused on the research, education, and preservation of our shared heritage in Calgary. We believe heritage is a dynamic process by which identity is experienced, interpreted, and represented, and we take pride in working with all Calgarians to honor the fabric that we're all a part of. We have a mission to embrace and keep space for the stories of this place and the vision of a city that understands and values its diverse heritage. And we're grateful to the City of Calgary for their ongoing support and funding that allow us to undertake this important and much needed work in our community. But now, to the main reason everybody's here this evening, I want to introduce you to our guest speaker, Darrel Babuk. Darrel joins us actually from Edmonton. He is from a railway family. He grew up living on the Canadian Prairie in railway stations. When he was a student at Crescent Heights High School, he started working for architect Bill Milne, maintaining drawings and letter files, and later held a similar position at the Dale Chandler Kennedy Group. While studying architecture at Montana State University, Darrel was elected to lead the national office of the American Institute of Architecture students in Washington, D.C. After interning at Bergner La Chapelle Architects, he eventually opened a practice in Chicago and worked with clients including the Chicago Public School Board and the Chicago Transit Authority. And his specialty became working with historic projects and their communities. Currently, Darrel bases his practice, Boreas Architecture and Civic Design in Edmonton, and his focus remains promoting and preserving Alberta's architectural heritage. Please join me in welcoming Darrel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me put on my eyes. Okay. So thank you. Calgary of the 1960s was a city of unbridled optimism and exuberance and energy. Jack Long once called Calgary the frontier. The entire community came together to give Calgary an undeniably distinct positive attitude expressed in its people and building. A very uniquely Calgary way of getting things done. It was a combination of very individual and creative architects, clients with grand dreams who allowed architects design freedoms, and adventurous builders who were up to challenges, of an entire community spirit. So let's go back and explore Calgary of the 1960s, and maybe you can leave this presentation with an understanding of how that optimism and gumption still lives in this city today. So there were several architects who are prominent in this era, and we don't have enough time, unfortunately, to talk about them all. This presentation will focus on three of those figures. It'll talk about Bill Milne, Philippe de La Salle, and Jack Long. And this presentation is based on my personal experiences. As a high school student at Crescent Heights, I was consumed by an interest in architecture. I wanted to work for an architect. So in the summer of 1974, I took my 10th grade drafting project, a vacation cottage in the international style, and I hand-lettered resume, and I presented myself to every architect in downtown Calgary. And eventually, I came up to the Brady Building, which I had long admired. And I saw this plaque, and this may not work on the screen, but there was a plaque by the front door. I'm not sure if it's there anymore. It announced that W.G. Milne was the architect of the Brady Building, and his name was on the lobby directory. So I took the elevator up to his office and was met by a very stern British lady, Joan Thibert, who told me that Mr. Milne was one of Calgary's better architects. And I was overwhelmed by it all. I simply responded, well, he must be if he designed this building. And with that, I was hired as the office boy. I know it's a sexist thing, but okay. I was responsible for maintaining the drafting room's drawing, letter, and product files. And many of those files fortunately found their way into the provincial archives of Alberta. So let's take a look. We're going to start with Bill's archives. And this is pretty telling. There was this leather-bound portfolio binder that was living in the conference room library. And this particular binder was for presentation to potential clients. This portfolio contained lists that tell a lot about Calgary overall, what was expected of Calgary architects. So opening the first card here was Bill Milne's qualifications. And it's the sorts of contacts and associations expected for an established architect in the late 60s in Calgary. You can see his education. He graduated from the University of Manitoba. You can see his registrations. He was a member of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, and he held registrations in Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. Professional organizations, he was active in the Alberta Association of Architects, but was very active around City Hall and various planning and building appeal boards. It shows his accountants. I'm not sure if Touche Ross have that suite anymore. It was the penthouse of what was the Texaco building. And looking at this now, and it didn't dawn on me at the time, British reference. I'm not sure why an architect needed to have British references. Now, the next one is even more telling. It's a partial list of clients. So he has private and public clients. If you look just down a little bit here, Western Union Insurance Building. So that's the Western Union Insurance Building at 8th Avenue and 6th Street. The man who ran Western Union was the founder of it, was Dave Fries. Apparently his original office in the Western Union Insurance Building was still intact and available for lease as late as 2012. And it was very flamboyant. It was designed by an interior designer from New York City that Dave brought out. And Dave had a real penchant for exotic cars. The building was designed on columns, so you could park underneath it. And I remember walking by there and salivating over Dave's Lamborghini Espada. I'm not sure if there are any others in Western Canada. It was always parked there. You'll also notice Ravens Limited. So Ravens Furniture Store at 7th Avenue and 9th Street. But also Albert Raven, the two brothers, Albert and Lionel. Albert Raven commissioned Bill to design his house. So Bill did a fair bit of variety of work. You'll also notice Sam Hashman and Company Limited. Sam Hashman owned a construction company, then developer, and that developer became Great West Equities, and then Trizac. How Bill explained this to me. From my Chicago days, 1997, all of a sudden, Trizac bought the Sears Tower, this company from Calgary. So I called Bill. We stayed in contact. And news of this hadn't reached Calgary yet. Bill was quite surprised, and I was hoping that Sam Hashman would still be around and perhaps I could find a way to do some work with Trizac. And Sam had already retired. But Bill's story of Sam. So Sam started out building and managing duplexes on 69th Avenue, just west of the McLeod Trail. And he also curbed used cars, believe it or not. Okay? And this grew. He started to build shopping centers. He started to build small office buildings and larger office buildings. Eventually, he joint ventured with Sam Zeckendorf from Montreal, who controlled the Bronfman portfolio. So Sam's company, TriStar, and Sam Zeckendorf became Trizac. And suddenly this bought the Calgary Tower, or the Sears Tower. I was beside myself. And then here's a partial list of Bill's projects. They're varied. These days, an architect may specialize in a certain building type or a certain project type. Perhaps they only do shopping centers or office buildings or schools. and they may specialize in certain client types. Perhaps they only work for government entities or only not-for-profits or developers. But you can see Bill, he did retail places, he did hotels, he did schools, he did office buildings. He even did buildings in Banff. And the best way to describe Bill's relationship here is that he traveled with his clients. People like Sam Hashman, who started out doing these wood frame duplexes and suddenly are doing large office buildings, Bill would adapt to that. So as a result, the office was very heavy on research of different building types. So my experiences working in the office of W.G. Milne Architect were in the drafting room. So I heard many stories from draftsmen. So here's Bill. Bill was a very personal guy and very difficult to find a photograph of. He was nothing short of legendary. So during my Chicago years, I had the chance to meet up with Dave Bronconnier when he was the Alberta trade emissary to the States. We both knew Bill and we swapped stories of him, and we soon realized that, yeah, he was an enormously private fellow, and if a group of people who knew Bill came together, everyone would know something about him that no one else did. So what we gleaned: Bill was born in Winnipeg, and he was a World War II fighter pilot, shot down behind enemy lines, and he escaped. He studied architecture at the University of Manitoba, and at the same time, he was the quarterback for the University of Manitoba Bisons. His nickname was Tiger, which, if ever there was a cause that he championed, he certainly became a tiger. He was a visionary, and he was very much a part of this community. I addressed him as Mr. Milne, but when I graduated from high school, he took me aside, scolded me, and said, "Call me Bill," which I did. Bill championed environmental causes like Fish Creek Provincial Park. According to Alan Warwick, he came up with a plan for Fish Creek. He presented it to Alan Warwick, who was Urban Affairs Minister at the time, and Peter Lougheed. They were both taken by it. Bill simply gave them the drawings and said, "Take this, and I don't want my name on this. You take credit for it." That's what Alan told me. Kind of the same thing with Kananaskis in a legendary helicopter ride. We stayed in contact. We had many conversations, and I really wish I could have had many more conversations with him. Last time Bill and I got together, just a couple months before he passed away, I was up in Calgary. I was living in Chicago still, and we had lunch at the Palliser. I think he had a private table of his own at the Rimrock Dining Room looking at this. Bill shied away from clubs. And I actually had a chance to meet Mrs. Milne once. Lorraine Milne was a clinical psychologist and eventually became a professor at Mount Royal. So one of the draftsmen at Bill Milne's office was Ed Surowski. And Ed had previously worked at what was then known as the Cohos Evamy Partners, but previous to that was Cohos de la Salle Architects and Engineers. Ed spoke of Philippe de la Salle's fantastic house on Beau Crescent in Beauness, and spoke of gracious hospitality from Philippe and his wife, Mireille. I found it curious, as Philippe de la Salle wasn't affiliated with the Cohos Evamy Partners at the time, and he seemed to be somewhat obscure. And there has been some recent interest learning more about Philippe de la Salle and his contributions to Calgary architecture. I spoke with Robert Claiborne, one of the principals, one of the partners at Dialogue, who knew Philippe. What he told me was Philippe was born in France, in Paris. And after his mandatory military obligation, he saw this banner stretched across the Paris Opera House, recruiting plain laborers to come to Canada. Philippe had this dream of becoming a lumberjack. So he crossed the Atlantic on the SS Franconia. He arrived in Halifax to start life in Quebec as a lumberjack. And one of his foremen told him that he had absolutely beautiful penmanship, and because of that, he should be an architect. So with all that, he was accepted into the McGill University School of Architecture. He traveled to Calgary after his graduation to set up practice as an architect with a fellow McGill grad, Martin Cohos. Philippe obviously had a love of the mountains. I mean, he wanted to be a lumberjack. Suddenly, he's an architect. He was a very gifted design architect, and he became the design partner in the firm. And yet another architect who caught my attention because of his work was Jack Long. Jack was born in Pennsylvania, and he studied architecture at the Pennsylvania State University. And I had a conversation yesterday with his daughter, Margot, who is a landscape architect in Vancouver. What Margot was telling me was a client of Jack's named John Williamson, who was an oil baron in Pennsylvania, Bear in mind, Sun Oil Company had its headquarters, they still may, in Philadelphia. John Williamson commissioned Jack to design a house for him in Calgary. Jack came up here. He thought this was absolutely wonderful, believing that there were already too many famous architects in the States, so he was crowded out of the market. He saw Calgary as a frontier, and he had a much better chance of becoming a famous architect if he practiced here. So he moved his family sight unseen from Washington, D.C. to Calgary, where he set up his practice. Jack championed the Inglewood neighborhood and eventually studied urban planning at McGill, and he became an alderman at the city of Calgary. There are many quotes I could find attributed to Jack, but the one that stuck here was, "There is an infinity of possible viewpoints, but the only one that can be said to be proper is the standpoint or viewpoint of the community itself." So we're going to go back to the Brady Building. Now, I'd always been an admirer of the Brady Building. At the time, it was not a tall building. You can see by the rendering here that was done by Nelson MacDonald. At the time, the city of Calgary, in its building permit application requirements, required that there be a colored rendering, 3D rendering taken from eye level of the building. And Nelson MacDonald, who did a lot of these renderings for many architects, did this one. It was pretty fabulous. The Brady Building struck me as being a lively urban wall set behind a park. It had a tremendous boulevard presence. And the Brady Building was originally built as an office condominium building, and its owners included Bow Valley Industries, the Seaman family, and W.G. Milne Architect. In 1974, there was a 6-story addition built on top of the building, which makes it look like it does today. The Brady Building, like the Western Union Insurance Building, stood on pilotis, on columns, and it had fancy cars parked underneath. And this was, cars parked underneath and an open ground floor was a common feature of many of Bill's buildings. And in front of it was this fountain called Steeples, and it's kind of crowded out today. There is a series of planters, a series of pools there, and they've been filled in, you can see by the glass on the side, which covered up that plaque that I told you about. But this fountain was incredible. It was plumbed to spit both fire and water at the same time. Oh no, Bill had a small-scale model of this on his desk. I'm guessing that the water and the natural gas is still there. It really was fabulous. And yeah, Zoraka, I'm going to have to point you out on this because I know that the Brady Building shows up on the Brutalist website. No, it's not Brutalist, okay? And without getting into a discussion of Peter and Allison Smithson and the New Brutalism, Bill had a fascination with Frank Lloyd Wright's work. Again, in that conference room library, he had many books of drawings of Frank Lloyd Wright, and he spoke relatively often of his University of Manitoba class field trip to Chicago, where he visited many Frank Lloyd Wright buildings in person. So the Brady Building, to me, evokes images of Frank Lloyd Wright's textured concrete buildings. So on the left, you see the Brady Building, taken last October, and on the right, you're seeing Frank Lloyd Wright's Ennis House in Los Angeles, which is one of many textured concrete buildings Frank Lloyd Wright did. And I really believe that was something that influenced Bill. Another draftsman in the office was Bob Bell. Bob taught me how to draw. He had an incredible hand drawing. And he also had this, he articled under an architect in Belfast. He migrated to Canada in the late 1950s. He interviewed with Bill on his arrival, and Bill promptly hired him. And I recall Bob's account of his first dinner in Canada being a dinner of Barney's Kentucky Fried Chicken at the Stampeder Hotel. And this comes up later in my presentation. And he was quite taken by given this little tub of honey to dip the chicken in. He'd never seen that in Ireland before. So Bob had an incredible hand drawing. And he had this theory that I never quite understood. If you notice, none of Bill's drawings or Bill's buildings have perfect circles on them. Bob had this idea that you should slightly squash a circle in order to preserve emphasis. And he tried explaining this to me on several occasions. I could never understand it, but I guess it worked. I got a call from Bob just before the pandemic. He was clearing out some drawings from his house, and he found this. And this is one of Bob's drawings. It's of the Albert Raven House in Bel Air. So another one of Bill's projects, the John J. Boland Building, and it's a very sensitive application of scale for a prairie city. Calgary has difficult sites to have a monumental scale unless you were to get some sort of a closure of the alley. So for this building, the tower, as you can see on the inside the plastic pocket in the archives, the tower is set behind two masses that flank it. The land titles office is on the right side of your screen, and then the family courts is on the left side. The land titles office was torn down in order to build the new courthouse, and it disrupted the rhythm of this site. But you can see on the floor plan here, this nice forecourt that was built as the entrance to the office building. And just taking a photograph of it and trying to avoid the land titles building in there, it sets back, it gives a very nice sense of scale for what was then a small prairie city. My lunch hours, I used to go wandering around Eau Claire and sketch some of the houses that were there. And then I'd come back to the office. The Brady Building never had a big dramatic lobby. It was very sensitive in its scale, and Bill's buildings always struck me as being very sensitive in their scale. And something that I really want to point out at the Boland Building are the brick patterns. Now, Bob had a real talent for brick details. The zipper that you see, this is on the family courts, and it's also replicated on the tower. That is something that Bob came up with. The land titles building had a similar zipper detail, and I just remember that it was different. I can't remember what it was, but I want to say that instead of the zipper being at the edges, the zipper was in the middle. And that was quite a detail. And there are all sorts of brick details if you look at Bill's buildings. Something that was a favorite of his, you can see it on the Mannix building here, is a basket weave. Now, Bill's favorite brick was a buff-colored brick. You see it on the Raven store, and I just haven't gone out there to take a photograph of it. Eventually, the supply of buff-colored brick got to be fairly limited, and in order to get that coloration, it needed an additive to it. It became an expensive brick, so Bill started to work in red-colored brick. Basket weave was one of his favorite patterns. Also, flooring patterns, herringbones, and even ramps to parking garages. Bill would do a herringbone-style ramp. And these examples are taken from the Mannix building at 7th Avenue and 7th Street, and the AMEC building, 6th Avenue and Center Street. I can't do this presentation without talking about the Calgary Tower, even though I don't know an awful lot about it. What I do know about it, it started out as the Husky Tower, which is where the Husky Oil building is these days, at 9th Avenue and 6th Street. And it was a project to celebrate Canada's centennial. It was completely privately funded, and that's the image that you see on your left. Eventually, the observation tower format was very popular at the time, and I remember seeing in letter files examples of the Seattle Space Needle and the Tower of the Americas in San Antonio, Texas, which is what this was patterned off of. Eventually, this became a project of Marathon Realty. Marathon Realty is the real estate arm of Canadian Pacific, and the image on your right, it was to replace the Canadian Pacific railway station. Marathon, Bill worked with Marathon, came up with some schemes for it, but Marathon's architect was Albert Dale. So Albert Dale wound up doing the final design. And I know that many people will attribute the Husky Tower, now the Calgary Tower, to Bill. It was his concept, but not his design. It was Albert Dale's design. Over on the side table, those two gray books, that summer in 1976, when I worked for the Dale Chandler Kennedy Architectural Partnership, Albert Dale was going to throw out some of his magazine profiles. And I said, wait a minute. And those things have traveled with me for 40 years. Don't take them out of here, whatever you do, okay? So a client that appears on all three of these architects' portfolios is Sam Switzer, who's one of the two Sams. The other Sam was Sam Hashman. Sam Switzer was a visionary. He was a shopkeeper, builder, developer, and hotel operator. Sam encouraged his architects to dream and build their visions. And the two examples I'll show you here of Bill's designs for Sam Switzer, the used car chalet, which was one of Bill's very first projects that he built and he designed, I should say, before he discovered liability insurance. He was relieved when it was demolished in 1989, but it was cantilevered out over a hillside, about 39th Avenue and McLeod Trail. Motorists passing by would see cars parked on the hill, and salesmen who would have their offices in this building could see any prospective customer entering the lot. It had an enormous concrete toe underneath it as a counterweight. And the roof, I remember Bill telling me this, was made of 7/8 inch shiplap. In 1977, I think it was, I did a consolidation of some of the drawing tubes, of drawing files, and I remember coming across this particular project and the drawings were missing. So I don't know what has happened to them. Bill's archives at the Provincial Archives, yeah, fortunately there are some images here that are on card, but a lot of it is classified as 38 meters of uncatalogued microfiche, and I haven't gone through that. So I have no idea where those drawings could have gone. Could only speculate. And the other fabulous project that Sam did with Bill was the Summit Hotel. And again, heavy on research. Bill had never done a hotel before. And he discovered that you could expect a chambermaid in one shift to be able to service 14 rooms, which dictated the size of the floors of this hotel. 14 hotel rooms on one floor. And then up top, there was a revolving restaurant and lounge, and it was a pretty spectacular place. It had big-name entertainment come by, people like Danny Kaye and Rosemary Clooney, the Mills Brothers, and the Ink Spots. And Sam may have been very demanding, he was overall, but a really personable guy. Now, Sam's wife, and this shocked me when I heard about it, growing up as a young boy in the train station in Vulcan, Alberta, my favorite morning television show was Romper Room. Guess who Miss Ann was on Romper Room? She was Annetta Switzer, Sam Switzer's wife. And here you can see in the middle, meet Miss Ann in person. She's at Barney's Kentucky Fried Chicken one Sunday. I remember traveling into Woodward's at Chinook Center just to meet Miss Ann. This is all from Sam's autobiography, Seeking the Summit by Sidney Sharp, and I brought my copy of it here. I may leave that with the Calgary, Heritage Calgary. In 1978, at the top of the summit was closed. Suddenly it was not a tall building. It was surrounded by other buildings, and so it kind of lost its charm. And it was converted into 2 floors of additional hotel rooms. The draftsman who drew the drawings for that was Larry Yarwood. Larry was a very British guy, a very Cockney fellow, and he had a real sharp sense of wit. He floated around to different architects in Calgary, and you'll see some other of Larry's drawings here. But he had a nighttime gig. Larry was the lounge pianist at the top of the summit. And every now and again, his wife, Pat, would be there to give vocal accompaniments. Now, so Larry had stories, and I hope this isn't too offensive. So Larry he was a very kind of a charged sort of fellow, and he got real upset at one of the architects. He told this story. Someone who had gotten really charged at one of the architects they were working for, and I can only imagine who this was. And the architect said, look, can you please finish this project? Stay around, finish the drawings and specifications, we'll put it out for bid. Okay, so Larry finished the drawings, he left the firm, the drawings went out for bid, and a couple weeks later, the receptionist came very red-faced into the architect's office. She was wondering, she'd been getting all these phone calls from contractors who were trying to source out the 1.5 inches of chicken shit insulation that had been perfectly coordinated between the drawings and specifications. Oh, okay. So the very far right here, you can see Danny Kaye with Sam and Annetta Notice the floor. It's another basket weave. It's parquet flooring. Bill had that in his house too. His house unfortunately fell victim to the flood and is no more. Now, talking of hotels, many architects in Calgary suddenly started doing hotels. The Caravan Motor Hotel chain was the dream child of Sam Hashman. Bill was the architect of the Caravan Hotels in Edmonton and Regina. In Calgary, it was Abigov and Sunderland who did that. Who did the hotel. It's on the site where the Shell Center is now. There was an unbuilt addition you can see on the bottom of the right-hand screen that Bill did. It never came to fruition. And in the middle of all this were Cohos de la Salle and Associates. They were an upstart practice, starting work in 1960. What was notable is that Cohos Evamy, which was the outgrowth of Cohos de la Salle, actually was a large Calgary architectural practice that survived the crash of 1982. And like many architects of the 1960s, they had many different types of projects and clients. Many hotel commissions, including mountain lodges, given Philippe's love of the mountains and outdoors. Happy Valley Ski Lodge, which was a completely off-grid building and was later added on to. And this was one of the brainchilds of Philippe. I think you can notice in the very bottom right-hand corner there, it says microfilmed. So I only spent a couple hours. I was in town and I went to the Canadian Architectural Archives to look at this. So I just took photographs with my cell phone of the rolled up drawings. But it's possible to get actual clear copies, if you will, from the microfilm. Philippe did a lot of mountain hotel studies. He was really fascinated by this. On the left, it was a study for the Mountain Hotel Group. And on the right, it was a motel wing and main building for a proposed hotel at the top of the Rogers Pass, which was never built. But I really think that his pièce de résistance was the drawing title blocks read the Haysboro Vocational High School, which later became named Bishop Grandin High School and is now known as Lady of the Rocky School. It's on Haddon Road, just opposite the Heritage LRT stop. This is something I would definitely term as brutalist. It anchors, it buttresses the base of the hill. It's a lot of raw concrete and gives some really great contrast to prairie sunlight. I was amazed in the sketch drawings for this, the preliminary drawings, shading studies of the windows. This is how much design detail Philippe gave and how much he was really fascinated with prairie sunlight. And there's a bas-relief sculpture on it. The bas-relief was done by Robert Oldrick, who is a longtime friend and collaborator of Philippe de la Salle. Robert Oldrick was also the artist of the bas-relief that was facing 9th Avenue on the Glenbow Museum, which I understand has been removed and conserved, and I'm hearing that it is going to be placed inside the renovated museum as a permanent project, which is good. When I was running around photographing the high school, I didn't go inside. Just from attending basketball games, I kind of remembered the lobby. It had a very 1960s luminous ceiling that was framed quite nicely in rough-cut cedar. And this is the Philippe de la Salle house on Beau Crescent, the one that Philippe and Mireille would have gracious entertaining in. I don't think it exists. If you notice on the left, there is simply a legal description of where the house was. It didn't give a street address. And I tried looking that up on the City of Calgary website, and I'm sure that the lot has been subdivided. And I tried looking for the house on aerial photographs and could not find it. So for whatever reason, the house is not there. But note that it very gently steps down this hillside. A lot of buildings in Calgary at the time wanted to flatten out the site to make it easier. No, this nicely stepped down. It was really a very gently meandering down to the slope of the river, very sensitive sort of design. Now, Jack Long was the architect of many residential commissions. You're seeing again Sam Hashman's name come up. So on the left-hand side, Sam Hashman's Bel Air show home H-shaped. I didn't capture any images of this, but I really think that Sam may have been influenced a lot by the Eichler homes that you saw being built in the Bay Area of California. Again, given Sam's background from Pennsylvania, this is something that probably he would have come across in his education. The Chris Jansen and Hansen Construction show home in Bel Air, which is on the other side, and I understand this house still stands, it was a modestly sized house, but it contradicted many of the conventional massings that one would expect in a mid-1960s modern house. So, like many architects, Jack did a lot of multifamily work. I believe this building, I don't know if it still is standing, but it was on Elbow Drive, immediately south of the Kelvin Grove patio apartments, which I'll talk about, south of Glenmore Trail. Jack saw this as an opportunity for many modernist interpretations of multifamily buildings, suited for the bright sunlight and temperate climate. And again, it's the outside influences of Jack's background that celebrated Calgary's sunlight. And again, the Kelvin Grove patio apartments on Elbow Drive, just south of Glenmore Trail. This building won many awards and accolades in its day. I believe CMHC even gave it several awards. It was a very early project of a contemporary middle-class townhouse, which at the time was a very new idea for Calgary. On the title block, oddly enough, I don't know why all of Jack's drawings in the archives are stamped, but you'll notice they were drawn by L.A. Yarwood. Yeah, Larry got around to several different offices. But the real reason that we remember Jack is a project that was done by McMillan and Long Architects, the Calgary Centennial Planetarium. The design was chosen from a competition of many local architects. How many were there, Cynthia?
18.
18 local architects came up with a design for this. And the competition was directed by a professor from the UBC School of Architecture, Professor Henry Elder. From those 18, from locals, he chose 3 that he thought had some real promise. And they were advanced in the design competition for further development. This is something that could be yet another program, is simply all of the different design proposals that came up for the Centennial Planetarium. But the 3 architects who were invited here were McMillan and Long, Gordon Atkins, who I was tempted to put in this, but some of his work is a bit later, and Bill Bocock. And again, some of his work is a bit later than the period I'm looking at. There was substantial local talent in Calgary. And the contractor for this, the builder, Sam Hashman. So, despite the folksiness of Calgary's persona, this city punched well above its weight class. Despite its size, Calgary had proposals for the world's tallest building. Now, bear in mind, Calgary was like a quarter to a third the size that it is now. So this was a hotel for Jaime Singer, one of Bill Milne's clients. Bill, and I remember seeing the research papers in the files for this. Bill was looking at different ways to build super tall buildings, and he came across something that you saw a lot of in the late 60s, this idea of a tapered base, the Grace Building by Emery Roth in New York City, as well as the First National Bank of Chicago by Perkins and Will, which have this very same shape. And Bill adapted it for this. This building would have been 3 times the height of the Calgary Tower. Ooh, in Calgary. No, I mean, this was a very heady city. The project, Jaime got excited with it. This is how I heard the story from Bob. Jaime got excited with this hotel project, and every time Jaime met with Bill, it just got bigger and bigger. And not just the building, the economic pro forma was actually working, and it came to be this proposal for the world's tallest building. So, as Bob was telling me, he was working on sketches for this building throughout the day. Oh, all worn out. So he went home, turned on the CBC National News, and what did he see splashed across the screen but the sketch that he'd been working on all day? He had a fit. So anyway, so Calgary in the 1960s was a very personable, friendly, and highly optimistic place. It was very Folksy but open to welcoming newcomers, still very close and very community bound. In that newspaper clipping that I showed you, this was a quote that I saw from Jaime Singer. Nothing is impossible these days. Okay, Calgary had gumption. We did it. And what Bill always used to tell everyone in the drafting room, don't tell me why it can't be done. Show me how it can be done. And the title of Jack Long's planning thesis, after the planetarium project, he went to McGill, got a planning degree. His thesis was entitled, Every Man the Planner. But what really summed it up for me was a quote that Philippe de La Salle gave Robert Claiborne. I came to Canada as a lumberjack. So there's not enough time for me to display all of these architects who were very active in Calgary at the time. And perhaps that's something that could be done in future. But you know, thank you for letting me share this. This was kind of a commemoration of Bill Milne because it never happened. Bill was so private and personal. I don't know if he ever would have wanted this said while he was alive, but the story needs to be told. And something I'd really encourage you to do. These are the sources, the archival sources that I used. Bill's archives wound up in the provincial archives in Edmonton. No idea why. Apparently, from what Bob was telling me, they started talking to the Canadian Architectural Archives, but they wound up in Edmonton. The Cohas Evamy Fonds and the Jack Long Fonds are at the Canadian Architectural Archives at the University of Calgary. I'm still part of a group of armchair historians in Chicago who get together once a month over gin and tonics to talk about the origins of the skyscraper. It's kind of like a book club. And every week, I haven't been to one of the meetings in person, not regularly, I still go, but every week someone will come with something that they have been researching. It's kind of like a book club. And when we do this online, I seem to have some very unique topics now that I'm in Western Canada. So I talk a lot about a protege of William LeBaron Jenny, who wound up in Winnipeg, and I talk about prairie grain elevators, which everyone finds to be a bit different. But I'm wondering, is there anything like that here in Calgary? And if not, you know, I wish I were in Calgary now. I know everyone kept saying I'm based in Edmonton, but I'm trying not to be. I would organize one of these groups if I were here. So I hope that someone might take that as a bit of an incentive. And perhaps, I know that Rob Gilbert at the university, at the Canadian Architectural Archives, was really keen on trying to start an archives club to see what's in the archives here and get to learn more of it. And with that, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Darrel. What a fantastic deep dive into Calgary's mid-century. And actually, it wasn't a deep dive. It was like a little scrape of the top of the skyscraper surface, wasn't it? Right. So we have a little bit of time left here, probably for 2 questions. So is there anybody who's got something that they're just dying to ask Darrel about? Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering, so since you're an architect and all that, if you could add any building to Calgary to improve the skyline, what would it be? What would you do? What would be your project? Do you have any ideas on that? Do you think of that, Ellen?
You know, I wouldn't do anything on the skyline. Calgary already has a skyline. Lots of cities have skylines. I think I would do something that would recognize our rivers, the lushly landscaped valleys, natural valleys we have, not unlike Philippe de La Salle's house. If only it could have that much space around it these days. That's what I try to do. I would do something that blends nicely into the landscape so that driving into Calgary, you're not seeing the scatter of rooftops. That's what I do.
Yeah, thanks. Anybody else? Yes.
Sorry, I don't know if I missed it. I don't know if I actually zoned out but just wondering about what happened to the tallest building.
Oh, it never got built.
Do you know why?
Well, it would have glutted the hotel room market. It probably I never asked, but I'm going to guess that it probably would have been around 3 million square feet. That would have been thousands of hotel rooms in Calgary. Yeah. So, yeah. And I was showing this to some of my colleagues, and their first comment was, oh, a building that shape, that tall, it would blow over. Yeah.
But there's buildings like that now in like the Middle East, I don't know, Abu Dhabi or something.
Yep.
That are very, very tall.
So like even the Burj in Saudi Arabia, its floor plan is star-shaped so that it's continually buttressed. This was not. It was simply a flat slab. Yep. There goes the Stephen Avenue Mall. Yeah.
Okay, and one more, right quick.
I'm just wondering, I'm thinking of the 1960s in architecture, Ayn Rand and the Fountainhead, your library, the books. Did you ever read it? Or
Oh, that's mandatory reading for any architecture student. Yeah, yeah. I can recall, in my travels when I was in Washington, D.C., and I had to visit as many schools of architecture as I could, that was a constant. You would find that student associations would rent that movie for a nighttime presentation every year, The Fountainhead. Yeah, and having practiced in Oak Park, which was Frank Lloyd Wright's neighborhood. Yeah, it's patterned off of Frank Lloyd Wright. He was kind of a nasty personality. Yeah, everyone loves his work, but there were all sorts of third-generation families who had stories of their grandparents being shopkeepers who would always have unpaid tabs from Frank Lloyd Wright because he would say that you ought to feel honored that my project used your product. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you.
And,